Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies workshop. You'll notice I've got a different background. I'm not sure which side it is because you never know, but we're in the process of just about to launch a new website and a new identity. And my colleagues at Democracy X, which is what the Danish Board of Technology are now called, have been doing a lot of work on this. So we're very keen on me showcasing it. So I'll keep pointing in the corner. Anyway, really pleasure to have you all here. Just a reminder that we're recording. If at any point you don't want your image to be on the screen, then have your camera off. Obviously, we'd rather have you have it on when we're doing stuff. Obviously, just to give you a bit of background to the before I give you a bit of background on today's call, I just wanted to recognize that the issues that some of us might be talking about today might be quite challenging for some of us in our identity as practitioners, researchers, and advocates. So we need to be a bit sensitive and respectful to each other's views in this space. But tends to be the case that actually everyone within Knoca is really nice, but it's worth saying that anyway. As we're progressing through the first half of the session, please do add questions in the chat. So let me just tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today and why we're running this session, and also introduce you to the panelists. So the standard way that we think about assemblies, if you like, the standard operating model is for a government at whatever level, so local, national, regional, international, to commission a climate assembly and then hopefully respond to its recommendations. That's the way that most of us think about an assembly. This is something that's organized by government. But actually, that's not always the case. And in the first 10 national assemblies that were run in Europe, one of them was actually run by a civil society organization, the German Bürgerat Klima, which we'll be talking about today, and also the Global Assembly, which happened in 2021. But they were kind of outliers at the time. They were quite unusual. But what's been really noticeable in the last year or two is that out of the next 4 climate assemblies that were organized, 3 of them were organized by civil society organizations, not by national governments. So this is the Citizens' Assembly on Energy Costs in Poland, the People's Assembly on Nature in the UK, which we're going to be talking about today, and also the Swedish Climate Assembly. And we also know, and we're going to be again talking about this today, about the Norwegian civil society organizations are looking to establish a climate assembly as well. So this is really an interesting emerging phenomenon. And I think as the Knowledge Network, we really need to think about what this means for us. So what we want to do in this workshop is to reflect on some of the challenges and opportunities of commissioning assemblies from within civil society as compared by doing it by government, and what this means for questions of processing integrity, and also what it means for thinking about impact pathways, because we can't assume that everything we have learned about government processes will just simply translate into civil society action. And there's an obvious reason why a lot of this is happening, because there's a sort of, for some people, a sort of disappointment about some of the agendas of national governments and a feeling that national governments aren't willing to deal with particular issues, which I think is driving some of this civil society action. And in terms of the sort of couple of areas I mentioned, so in terms of integrity, for example, how do we ensure that for a civil society organization process, it's not perceived as being prejudiced towards certain outcomes? How can we ensure that the assembly is organized in such a way that it is seen as legitimate across society? And particularly, what does this mean for the governance of assemblies? And when we think about impact pathways, obviously governments have an advantage. They're commissioning an assembly that they are in many ways are then responsible for responding and implementing. But here the commissioner is not always the target. So that's not always the case. So many of these assemblies are organized so that others, particularly government, will hopefully take action. The People's Assembly on Nature may be a bit different because some of its recommendations were actually for the organization itself. And also, I guess the question is, what is always the desired impact? Perhaps it is government policy, but there could be wider impacts as well in relation to public discourse, the change in other ways, including other institutions. So my sense is that we're seeing a range of different motivations and a range of different types of assemblies. And I'll just give you a flavour of the sorts of things that I think we're seeing. We're seeing demonstration projects by civil society organisations that their primary aim being to get governments to run assemblies themselves. So there's a kind of idea here that civil society is demonstrating to government that assemblies are a good thing to do. We're seeing assemblies focused on changing policies of governments or other organisations. So they're aimed at specifically trying to shift government or other organisations' policies where those organisations have not been willing to run assemblies themselves. We're also interestingly seeing assemblies being organised to change the policy of the organisation themselves. So, for example, universities, a couple of universities like in Lucerne have got their own assemblies, which are actually being organised internally. We're seeing assemblies that are being organised to try and change public discourse around climate, and certainly the Swedish Assembly fits that. And also we're seeing amongst some more radical social movements, the idea of building assemblies that are independent from government. They're actually independent governance architecture. So if you like, architecture to challenge the state. And for example, the Humanity Project in the UK is doing that. So we thought it was a really important opportunity for us to reflect on the development of these civil society organised assemblies. And what better way to do that than actually bring 4 people into the space who have actually done this, are doing this, or are planning to do this, and to get a sense of what's happened. And the 4 people we're going to speak to today bring a wonderful array of experience. We've got Percy Vogel, who is one of the architects of the German Assembly, which was the first national level, sorry, I'm being asked to confirm what language I'm speaking in. Sorry about this. There we go. I find it hard that no one that couldn't figure it out. But anyway, so Percy Vogel, who was if you like, was the architect of the first national level independent assembly. We've got Kat Machin, who's the head of community engagement campaigns at WWF-UK, who'll talk to us a little bit about the purpose and the structure and the impact of the People's Assembly for Nature. We've got Agim Selami, who's the executive director of the ZIP Institute in North Macedonia. We thought they were really interesting to get Agim along because for 2 reasons. One, to introduce the local into this, because we're typically looking at national level. And secondly, to bring in the experience of why independent assemblies in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's a really interesting question there. And then finally, we've got Marie Harbo Dahle from SoCentral, who's leading the development of our Norwegian assembly. And they're very much in the planning stages. So it'll be very interesting to hear how she's reflecting on what they're doing. So let me start by, if it's possible, to get Percy Vogel into the space with me. Percy is the co-founder and board member of the German NGO Bürgerbegehren Klimaschutz, excuse my German. He was the project manager of the first climate assembly for Germany in 2021. Can I just say that when I first met him, he didn't have grey hair. That happened during the assembly, I think. So yeah. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Anyway, Percy, could you tell us just initially a little bit about what the Bürgerbegehren Klimaschutz is, what kind of organisation that is, and why did you decide to organise an assembly? What was the motivation behind it? What was your target?
Yeah, thank you, Graham, and hi, everybody. Our organization was founded 16 years ago, and back then the idea was already to combine democracy and climate as 2 subjects or motivations. And back then it was the feeling very much that climate is something that happens at very high levels, United Nations and stuff internationally. And yeah, I had the idea of bringing it down into the responsibility of people mostly at the local level. So our organization tries to instigate and consult people at the local level to use methods of democracy, direct democracy at the local level to implement climate measures. So we're usually not active at the national level, but it's within the range of our statutes to do that. So when I was involved with people at the national level, it turned out that our organization was just in the right place to be the kind of carrier organization for such a project, and that's how that came to pass.
So can I ask it, why did you think of, because you are the first people at a national level to run an assembly,
Yes,
and
a civic society.
yes, as a civil society organization. Why did you even think of doing that? How did you think that that was a good way of engaging citizens? And maybe also talk a little bit
Yes.
about what your target
I have
was.
to correct myself. It's not entirely true, because there were these citizen assembly at the national level have been pushed for and have been tested by a German NGO called More Democracy, Mehr Demokratie. I used to work for them too, actually, before I founded this organization, and have been in close contact with them. And so there have been two assemblies at the national level kind of testing stage. And already when they were talking with the head of the parliament about the second one, many people said, oh, we really need a climate assembly. It didn't turn out. The second assembly had a different topic. But all the climate motivated people were thinking, oh my gosh, time is running out. Now we can only hope that then maybe in the next legislative period, we will have another assembly, maybe on climate. But then we realized, oh, that's so far away and so uncertain. Why not use the last year of this still ongoing legislative period to create these recommendations, the report of a climate assembly, that the next government after the coming elections can make use of them right from the beginning. So it was a consideration of time, and also we thought it was an interesting novel window of opportunity to use we were ultimately aiming at the coalition agreement of the new government. Everything that's in there is kind of makes up 80% or so of the program for the next legislative period.
So that's it's kind of interesting, actually, because if you're talking to a government, you would say the worst time to run an assembly is in the lead up to an election because you'll get lost. But
Yeah.
for a civil society organization, that may actually be the perfect timing to run an assembly in order to actually affect the next government. So there's a really interesting sort of difference in terms of
both true. It's both true.
in terms of cycles. So how did you ensure the integrity of the process? I mean, I could immediately say to you, oh, you're a climate organization. How on earth can you legitimately run a climate assembly?
Yeah, I've been socialized in, I would like to say, within science, and later in the organization More Democracy. So I'm used to not only take on my own perspective, but think inclusively about and with and consider people who think differently politically. And so I thought I have an idea how you should present yourself in a context where you want to reach as many people as possible. And then me, but also other people, help to ensure this integrity. But there were some difficult parts. For example, we were looking for a patron who is kind of center, and we were successful in finding a conservative former president as the patron of the whole project. Things like that were very important. We actively decided against gendered language, for example, even though there was a strong preference among the early staff members from organizations that were with us from the beginning, but we decided against it to not, put off conservatives and things like that. And then it goes into how the webpage looks and stuff like that. And most importantly, though, of course, the diversity of the NGOs that you reach to support your project. So we reached out in all directions and made sure that we had a really good mixture.
And in terms of actually governance, did you kind of use the standard idea of actually having kind of a stakeholder body and a science and a sort of evidence body? Was it sort of classic? Was it the sort of classic look for a climate assembly?
Yeah, exactly. We had a scientific board, and we had another board that was maybe the most difficult one with the stakeholder organizations, the larger ones, Unfortunately, we never got a union involved, but yeah, pretty much we got a good array. And for example, I always like to say that among the board members was the car lobby, the German car lobby were also invited because we were also talking about traffic and stuff. So we try to include everybody.
So in many ways, it actually looks like a governing an assembly that we might see from a government commissioned process in terms of
yes, yeah,
in terms of that. Yeah,
I think we were. It was a big issue in the beginning, and I think we managed actually to give a balanced appearance to the outside.
Okay, so I guess my question is, so how do you feel that what do you feel actually happened in terms of the impact of this process, and looking back at it, what might you have done differently? I mean, I know you were affected, for example, by the Ukraine war. Kind of had a major impact, and actually that affected the sort of government's capacity. But I'm kind of interested. You've run a civil society organized. What kind of recommendations do you give to other people who are thinking about following a similar path to you?
Yeah, it always goes back to resources, and maybe the most important resource is time, because my biggest recommendation would be to plan ahead as early as you can. And most important message maybe is there's roughly two phases. First is the phase where the actually assembly phase, from the sortition to the last meeting, and then writing up the report. And then the second phase is the phase where politicians come in, and I mean, it's not strictly divided, but in the second phase, you do the advocacy for the report. And this is a phase that when you are in a hurry, it seems far away. You first need the money to actually run the assembly itself and everything. And we are all fascinated with the process, and everybody is fascinated with the process. The media pay attention to all this. But few people are interested in what happens with the recommendations after the assembly is over. And we did have the rough idea. We just talked about it, that we aim at the coalition agreement and the negotiations there. And that's what we did. But it does make sense. But then as this the negotiations came closer, we realized, my gosh, everybody is busy with the elections. It will be really hard to talk to any of the politicians. And even when the elections are over, then immediately they start those negotiations. They won't have any time for any civic society members. So early on, we were thinking of a big meeting after the elections where we invite everybody in Berlin. And then we just declared it unrealistic. Nobody has the time. It was even worse than that. After the elections, the negotiating parties were just paying attention to themselves, right? And the negotiations were declared particularly secret this time, for whatever reason. So we sent the report to everybody involved. It's multiple times. So people had lots of chance to take notice of it, but we never got any feedback. We do see significant overlaps with what you find in the agreement, but it's certainly hard to trace back to just to us. Many other organizations did the same thing. So, and yeah, we did not. And then maybe the problem in our thinking is that we were thinking along the way what you described in the beginning. There's these steps. You hand over the report, but then it's up to the government. Kind of then you are done. But we realized, well, we shouldn't close the door for ourselves so early. Now we handed in the report for the negotiations, but well, we want to have still have a meeting with the politicians. But we did that step by step, and we had to come up with the resources. We had to talk to the politicians who were just newly elected. It took many weeks for the government before you even knew who to talk to. Then the Ukraine war came. And then, yeah, with hindsight, it would have been good to prepare all this much better, to have and ideally with some professional people who really know about political communication, who know about mostly the details, what Parliament Commission is going to meet when, and what are the windows of opportunities. And the simple problem there is, or the fundamental problem is having the resources, because you don't know, or we planned that the whole thing would be over by the end of the year, and then maybe with one follow-up meeting with politicians. But theoretically you can think bigger. I mean, the report lasts for the whole legislative period, right? Only at the end of the legislative period, it's clear has been implemented, what not. So my recommendation would be to come up with the resources to have a ongoing long communication process with the politicians over the rest of the legislative period. But you need lots of resources for that. Basically, I don't know, twice as much resources monetarily than just for the process. And that makes civic society run assembly even more expensive.
Yeah.
Than
So,
a government.
what's really interesting here, and we'll leave it here and we'll bring you back in a bit, is this idea of, because I think the same is true about state-run processes, is that people don't invest enough in the follow-up process afterwards.
Even there,
Yeah,
exactly.
so I think this is just a really interesting thing. Yeah. Percy, that's been really interesting. We'll pull you back in about half an hour when we have a panel discussion. But thank you so much for starting us off. That's really great.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to bring Kat in, who I can actually see nodding. And I think she's going to say, I say exactly the same thing as, I want to say exactly the same thing as Percy. Is that true, Kat?
Yeah, and especially I've literally just put as a note back Percy's point on time. So yeah, I really hear all of it. Really resonated a lot, Percy. So at least we know we're not alone in some of those challenges.
Yeah. Can you? I think maybe the first time we talked to each other, Kat, I said to you, you said, "Oh, I don't think we thought enough about what happened afterwards." And I said, "I don't think anyone ever thinks enough about what happens after." So don't feel too. So Kat, just give us a little bit of remind us about, we've had a call on the German Assembly. We've also had a call on the People's Plan for Nature. So you can go and see our previous recordings. But just briefly remind us, why was the People's Plan for Nature organised, and who was it? It's three major conservation organisations.
Yeah, so it was three of the largest nature conservation organisations in the UK. So that's WWF-UK. Obviously, we're a global charity, but we're based here in the UK and have our own office. RSPB, and they're the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and the National Trust. And between the three of us, it came as an opportunity related to a campaign called Save Our Wild Isles. So Save Our Wild Isles is a partnership between those three charities, and it was hooked around a television series. So David Attenborough is a major deal in the UK, massive national treasure, and he launched a television documentary series last year called Wild Isles. And we knew as charities this would be like the prime opportunity to talk about nature in the UK. But I've been working at WWF for about 4 years, and I've been working on quite a lot of projects related to David Attenborough documentaries. He's our president, and we do a lot of work with him. And we've learned a lot over the process of doing that and trying to connect in with communities and people and convert the awareness that you get from those documentary series to action. That although he is a trusted voice, he's not a very relatable voice. He's had a very extraordinary life. He's traveled the whole world. He's seen more wildlife than most people have ever seen. But people in the UK don't experience nature in that way. And so it became very apparent to us that we would need to do something that would centre the citizen voice in the UK and help us to develop a series of calls to actions that would work for people. And that is how we ended up going down the Citizens Assembly route. We looked at lots of different ways in which we might be able to achieve this, but we kept coming back to this concept of what happens if you put the power back into people's hands, and what happens if you equip ordinary citizens with the science that we have as organisations, and we put forward expertise from people from a broad range of questions, questions of expertise levels. So we had lots of people, from scientists to farmers to community leaders, speak to the Assembly as part of that process. So that's the concept that sat behind it. And we launched it alongside that documentary series. So the idea was that people would watch Wild Isles on a Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, and then we wrapped it around that Save Our Wild Isles campaign. And the People's Plan for Nature was the independences and voice that sat alongside it. So when we as charities were talking about things that we needed to do to protect nature, we could back that with an independent process that came out of the People's Plan.
So in terms of the, I mean, as I say, we've got more details elsewhere. I mean, it was a very successful process in the sense of spending 4 weekends building a plan, which actually has all sorts of recommendations for not only government, but also for yourselves, for local government, for other actors. I mean, it was, so I guess the question is, first of all, I mean, I think that it hasn't really been challenged that much in terms of civil society organisations running this. Are you quite surprised about that? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, we had some challenge. So the Daily Telegraph is one of the challenges, and that won't be a surprise to anyone that knows the media landscape in the UK. They have been quite challenging more broadly about citizens' assemblies more generally, but and also, you know, if you say something is put forward by the people, they are likely to question that, especially if you're putting forward anything that is maybe more radical in the actions that came through. So yeah, just for context, the People's Plan for Nature gives actions not only for government and local government, but for businesses, for charities like ourselves, for individuals and communities as well. And the idea that sat behind that was because we recognise that public trust in politicians has never been lower, and it's nature in the UK, the responsibility for acting on nature in the UK is really broad. It's not just governments that have a say in that. For example, RSPB and National Trust, who were commissioners of the People's Plan, are two of the largest landowners in the UK. They have a huge amount of jurisdiction over the way land is used in the UK. And similarly, businesses like food businesses, especially mass producers, have a huge amount of say in the way that nature is managed and the way that their practices impact on nature in the UK. What we kind of anticipated, so we worked really hard to make sure that the messaging demonstrated that this was broader than us. So we tried to do everything we possibly could to power the People's Plan, but not have it be front and center of our comms. So we didn't have any branding with Save Our Wild Isles partnership on it. We tried really hard to make sure that whenever we were talking about the People's Plan, it was from the Assembly members and rather than as our charities. And whenever we talk about it, like for example, now we are really, really clear that it was independent. We commissioned it because we wanted to see what the citizen voice on this was. And we put ourselves in as the actors that have the responsibility to it, because that level of independence was so important. And I think in doing that and communicating that, we avoided quite a lot of clash from actors like government. And the problem we've had probably is maybe less I would probably take more criticism and more notoriety that comes with it, if I'm honest. I'd rather us maybe ruffled a few more feathers in order to get more impact and more people talking about the People's Plan. It's not to say that it has landed flat at all. It's definitely having an impact, but yeah, we didn't get as much of an expected kind of backlash as maybe we were prepped for.
And looking back, because I mean, I know you're still working with some of with many of the members now, and it goes back to Percy's point, which is that, you know, looking back, it would have been really great if we'd been able to develop a different type of impact plan, but you kind of only know that afterwards. Yeah. Apart from trying to get a bit more notoriety, what do you think you could have done if you're having your time again and you thought, oh, I know this is going to land? What kind of work do you think you would want to do, both in terms, I guess, internally, but also in terms of the people who the plan is aimed at?
So there's a couple of things I would do differently. I wrote them down. So earlier engagement, as I check my notes, earlier engagement with the people that we're looking to influence, we really, really needed to get that right. And we did do the kind of usual Citizens Assembly kind of practice of enabling observers to come and see the Citizens Assembly process. But because it was so abstract at the beginning, it was really difficult to get that engagement and get people to understand what it was that we were trying to achieve with it. And I was thinking about whether I still don't have the answer on this, but I think it would be interesting for a civil society organisation to partner with a select committee in the way that the UK work, a cross-party committee, so that you had a government stake in the commissioning process. So it wasn't all government-led, but you could have
parliamentary stake.
Yeah, a parliamentary stake, not a government stake. And that could have been very interesting because it would have given us a bit more of a shoe into Parliament. But it would have enabled us to still do what we wanted to achieve with the People's Plan. And I feel what we have, which was to make it broader than government and have people see their responsibility that sits within it. So I don't know how that would land, and I don't know how that would play out, and I'm sure it would overcomplicate things. But that would be a very interesting model to take. And I think we would look at, if not partnership, then some form of early engagement with a select committee where they committed to taking the People's Plan into government in some way, or into Parliament in some way. We are 3 of the largest nature charities in the UK, but we're not the only ones. And I think a wider partnership of commissioning organisations would have supported more response from our own sector. One of the areas that I was really surprised by was we had a really amazing array of support at launch, but we haven't been able to maintain that engagement with our sector on what the People's Plan is and what it represents, because it is actually a gift to the nature charity sector to show that we've got this public mandate for a lot of the work that we do, and it is a constant battle to remind people of that. And we also want for our People's Assembly members who are still engaged with us to see that the sector is working together. It's one of the calls to the action in the plan is for us to be more than the sum of our parts. So earlier engagement with the sector, we started engaging the sector about 6 months before we ran the first Assembly weekend. But I think we could have done that earlier, and we could have found ways in which to embed them further. We had some of our closest allies, I guess, wildlife trusts and other charities in the advisory group, but maybe a bit more of a dedicated position for them so that we could have further kind of commitment from our teams. I'm just conscious that our exec director for people and culture is trying to get into this room. Okay. So bear with me 2 seconds as
I'll bring you back. I'll bring you back in 20 minutes. That's fine. No, I completely understand, Kat. 1 second. See you in a minute. So okay, that's really great. Let's bring Agim into the space. So Agim is the executive director of Zip Institute. Do you want to just explain, Agim, what Zip Institute is? I don't think many people will know.
Certainly. Thanks for having me, Graham. It's a pleasure to be here today to share what we are doing in the course of the Skopje Climate Assembly. Zip Institute is an NGO which we have founded in 2012, so more than a decade, serving democracy in our country, a fragile democracy, I must say, and we've been trying to somehow mend or to correct the flaws of our democracy. We've come up with the idea of organizing citizen assemblies, deliberative democracy, through one of the most renowned organizations worldwide, the New Democracy Foundation from Australia, who have somewhat guided us through the first citizen assembly that we organized during the COVID-19 pandemic. And ever since 2012 and onwards, we've tried to integrate as much as possible the elements of deliberative democracy, because as an organization, and also myself, because I've also written my master thesis on the deliberative democracy perspectives in countries with fragile democracy systems like North Macedonia. So it's both a personal pursuit, but also as an organization, my team is also very much interested in advancing these types of innovative forms of citizen participation. We also work on many other issues, but let us not spend time.
No, that's fine. That's really interesting. I mean, you've already brought in something new there, which is this issue of kind of operating in a fragile democracy. And I'm kind of interested that you, as a Zip Institute, have commissioned this assembly and not the Skopje local government. And is that a purposeful strategy on your part, that this needs to be, because in the UK, for example, or in other parts of Western Europe, we would look towards government to run the kind of assembly that you've got, but it seems to be really critical that it's run by a trusted civil society organization. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking there? Why are you running these things and not pressurizing the local government to do it?
It's a very, very good question. But if I see on the participants list people that are very familiar with the context in our region, in the Western Balkans, and there is a truth, a fact that civil society is the main driver of innovation in our countries. So if civil society undertakes something, then logically it would be the public sector or national local institutions following suit after that. We wouldn't expect that these types of innovations, of participation in innovation among citizens would be somehow initiated by state institutions because of a set of reasons. Mainly, they don't really have an interest to involve citizens, maybe one of the main things I would say, but also lack of capacity, lack of vision, maybe to keep citizens informed on how they come up with certain policies and decisions. And on the other side, civil society in our region has received huge capacity building support from European Union on topics like this. So it's logical that these types of innovations would emanate or would originate from civil society.
Okay, so what is the relationship then between, so you're running this assembly now, and we should say that I think you were saying that you're just getting to the recommendation writing stage of it, but you're running this assembly now. What sort of response have you had? I mean, is your target government, or is your target the broader society in Skopje? What are you hoping to see as the actual outcome of this, apart from the recommendations? Is it to try and impact local government policy, or is it to impact other actors within the city?
No, primarily we started with the idea to impact local policy making, which is related to lowering air pollution rates in Skopje. So this is why we initiated the whole climate assembly. But because I cannot talk about impact on the policy level, because we are still at an early stage to say anything on that, I think that what we have achieved, and this was like a side effect of the first targeted impact, is that we managed to bring climate debate and discourse to the lay citizens level, because we haven't seen this before. Usually the debate and the whole coverage of topics related to climate has been taking place among these so-called elite layers of our society. These are usually civil society organizations that are internationally exposed. These are maybe politicians. These are maybe employees in the state apparatus. But it was never the case you'd see lay citizens discuss about topics that are related to climate, and in our context about air pollution. Everybody is concerned. Everybody has direct negative consequences from the air pollution, but there was no previous initiative that would bring lay citizens through a random selection process, through sortition, to sit together, to hear from various sources, from various experts, and then to have an informed opinion on where air pollution comes from and what citizens can do to keep locally elected officials accountable when it comes to public health and to air pollution in general.
Oh wow, okay. So you've actually already feel that you've had that, you've got a sense that you are becoming you are actually shifting some of the public discourse within the city. That's really interesting.
It's a small group. We have around 65 citizens participating at the city level of Skopje. But what is novel about this process, which is also new for us, is that there is a fatigue among civil society organizations to organize activities where you'd see the same group of people circulating from one event to another, because these are the people that are usually more inclined to attend activities organized by the civil society. And now with the Climate Assembly, because of all the sortition and the random selection of citizens, it's also very exciting for us to see people of all layers of the society in one conference room, sitting together, discussing, regardless of their differences, of their ethnic, religious background, age, profession, all sorts of these differences. They've come together to create a group which would act as a single voice in proposing measures against air pollution.
And finally, do you have any sense that has there been much interest from government, from elected politicians, from civil servants, or is this being seen as something rather odd and rather strange? I mean, what are they? Is there a sense that this might shift their way of thinking around public engagement?
We acted quite expeditively in a sense that we managed to get signed papers and MOUs with these institutions that we were targeting. So formally, they are obliged to hear the recommendations and also to report on them. We can't force them, obviously, but at least we are safe on the side of having things written on paper. The issues and the dilemmas that we were being told by them was that how could we expect lay citizens to tell us what we can do, knowing that they don't have prior information, they don't have expertise on the topic. So we had to talk to them extensively on this in these aspects, telling them how the whole process looks like, how citizens are being capacitated to have an opinion, and how all the recommendations and decisions emanating from the Climate Assembly are sort of a collective wisdom, and that they vote, and all decisions are taken based on consensus. So I think it started to make sense to them eventually.
Okay. And do you think, just as a final comment, do you think we should expect to see more civil society organized assemblies actually happening across your region? Do you think is this just something that's happening in North Macedonia, or do you think there's a broader movement of trying to organize independent assemblies by civil society?
I will say this, maybe I will not sound modest, but I think we are the first ever to organize a climate assembly in North Macedonia, and it's one of the few taking place in the wider Western Balkans region. So the whole concept is very new, but I think that there will be like a snowball effect, because the more CSOs especially organize climate or citizen assemblies in general, they will also bear the fruits of it, because, as I said, you get exposed to very different perspectives and views from citizens that you would have huge difficulties reaching out to.
Okay. Agim, thank you so much, and we'll drag you back in a second. I'll just finally talk to Marie from SoCentral, who is at the moment pulling together as I understand it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but pulling together a coalition to actually run an assembly looking at Norway's growing oil and gas wealth at a time of climate and ecological crisis. Am I right?
Yes.
You're still trying to do this?
Still absolutely still trying to do this.
Even after what you've just heard from the other three, yeah, still going for it.
I mean, even more so, because we have the luxury of being able to learn from past mistakes and insights, which is also why we're here. So I'd like to underline that we have not done this yet. We've done a few smaller assemblies for municipalities and such, but we have not done neither.
One of the reasons it was so exciting to get you into the space was to sort of just hear about your thinking and what you've actually learned from, because I know you've talked to some of the people on this call already about your project. So what's the purpose of actually running an assembly? Why a national assembly in Norway run by civil society organizations?
So for us, I work at SoCentral, it's a non-profit company that works to bring people together to solve complex social challenges, and that could be anything from youth inclusion to climate crisis.
And then, so for us, I also have to confirm my language, which is not Spanish. American. And for us, we came into this because we were part of a wider conversation about really Norway's moral dilemmas as one of the major extractors and producers of oil and gas in the world and exporters of oil and gas. We also profit massively from the war of aggression in Ukraine. So as the war goes on, our profit grows in what we have called our savings pension fund, but which is actually revenue from the oil and gas industry going into a public fund. And a lot of people were feeling queasy about this in Norway, both in public, in the newspapers and in the public conversation, but also privately. I think a lot of people started to feel like something about this feels really off. Also because the consequences of that oil production is an exacerbated climate crisis. And so we convened a meeting of a few tens of people about a year ago talking about not citizens' assemblies, but like, what do we do about this issue? How can we change the way we think about our common values in Norway? And I mean like financial values. What responsibilities and roles do we actually have in the world? And this money is meant to safeguard future Norwegian generations, but is letting the world burn essentially and just sitting on our pile of money is that really what is ensuring that safe future? And we invited people into a big conversation about this. And one of the ideas that came up was a citizens' assembly, because as you can hear, there are no clear answers to how we should do this. Famously also, all the Norwegian parties and the government is very hesitant to change anything about how the pension fund manages its wealth. It's very conservatively managed, and there's really no opening for a political conversation about this as of now. And for us, we also came into this because we have been looking at citizens' assemblies as a way of engaging people in new democratic ways and just through our work with municipalities and participation. So for us, this was also testing this on a larger scale. And then we knew that it was going to be a very steep hill to climb to get the Norwegian government on board on doing anything on this. And so that's when the idea of bringing in civil society to commission came up.
Okay, and how's that idea worked? I mean, have you found a group of commissioners who are willing to take this on? And do you have a sense of how you're going to position the assembly in terms of what, you know, in terms of what we were hearing before of actually sort of developing an impact strategy for it? Where is your thinking on that? Because the lessons we've got from the first two speakers are, oh, I wish we'd spent more resources and time thinking about what happens afterwards. You've got the luxury of thinking about that, but now you've got to kind of act on it. So first of all, who have you brought together, and what's your thinking in relation to impact?
Yep. So we have a lot of things in place, and then a lot of things that are not settled yet. So the commissioning bodies are now, as of now, the Norwegian Children and Youth Council, which organizes over 100 Norwegian children and youth organizations. We also have a Center for Long-Term Policy. It's a think tank essentially on existential threats and safeguarding future generations. It's quite new in Norway. We have the largest foundation that ensures the freedom of expression in Norway. It's a private nonprofit foundation. And then we have 3 humanitarian relief organizations. So Save the Children in Norway, the Norwegian Church Aid, and then Caritas, which is a Catholic humanitarian organization. And so all of these have come on board in the past 6 months. Wow. We started with a few, and then we discussed with them, who else do we need as part of this coalition to make sure that we are broad enough and who owns this, I guess, enough that they want to be a commissioning body. and then balancing that out with who should be more on like an advisory, in an advisory role, or supporting it but not being commissioners. So we've discussed that a lot. And then we as SoCentral have a role in convening and organizing and figuring out, you know, governance, funding. And the lessons that we've heard is definitely that we are going to need a lot more funding for the aftermath of the assembly than we originally thought. So yeah, that's also, so our status is right now is we have about a third of the funding confirmed that we would need for like the minimal viable process of actually doing this, and working really hard because we have a deadline. There are Norwegian national elections coming up in a year and a half. And we really, really want this process to happen ahead of all of the parties setting their political manifestos and being swallowed in like the campaign organizing. So we would really like to have this fully funded and actually done by the end of February next year.
So in many ways, actually, you're sort of building on the German climate assembly model of actually trying to affect that moment of sort of political parties putting their manifestos together, but also the potential coalition agreement that might come out afterwards. That's your political opportunity, yeah. Yes,
and then I mean showing politicians and parties that the Norwegian citizens are maybe more ahead in this question, that they think that they are less conservative on what our role should be and how our money should be managed. I mean, that's our hypothesis. It could be absolutely wrong. But that's the motivation behind this, is trying to open up a broader public conversation, because it will not come from those parties, but they might welcome it if it comes, but they will not initiate it because it has too much of a political risk.
So in an interesting way, you may actually give political license for politicians to do something on this in a way that they can't actually, at the moment, they feel so constrained. They feel so constrained. What's been the reaction of people? Because Norway doesn't have a big tradition of doing assemblies. So what's been the reaction to the idea of an assembly? Has that been quite a difficult conversation to have, or has actually been people been open to the idea?
I would say a lot has changed in just the past year and a half, 2 years, as this has become more known in Norway. I mean, a few processes have happened at citizens' assemblies and panels, but just spread out over the past 20 years, and none of them have been on a national level or large. And then we started working just like to bring this into the Norwegian way of working 4 or 5 years ago. So there's been a few local municipality processes, but it's still very radical in Norway to think about engaging citizens in this way. Okay. So some people are very on board and some people are very skeptical. Okay. So there's an interesting thing. You're running this assembly both have substantive impact, but it's also raising the kind of profile of the idea of assemblies as well, which is really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so that's really helpful, Marie. Can I get the other three back into the room? Is that possible? So this has been just having heard all four of you tell your stories has just been really, really, really interesting, and the various connections between them. I kind of want to just kind of suggest a couple of things, and I'm interested to your response, and these have just come out of the conversation. The first is obviously, what's the motivation here? And for all of you, it seems to be that the motivation is that there has been an unwillingness by governments or by other actors to act. So you're kind of, the intervention here from all of you is trying to move the political agenda, move the political dial in some way, and that actually an assembly might be able to help you do that in a way that traditional campaigning and other ways of doing things might not. So there's a really interesting sort of shared purpose across. And the other thing that strikes me is really, actually, there's the three things, I think. The other thing that really strikes me as interesting is that for civil society organizations, trying to figure out where the right time to do this is really interesting. So both
both Percy and Marie from Germany and from Norway very much focusing on a particular moment in the political cycle. I didn't really explore that so much with well actually for WWF was the production of this amazing BBC film. So there's a kind of and I didn't get with Agim as to why this particular moment, but perhaps we can talk about that. And then the third thing is just the challenge of doing impact. And it strikes me that one of the interesting things here with a government commissioned assembly is at least the government has a whole bunch of structures within which it can deal with the assembly. It might not do it very well, and in most cases doesn't do it very well. But you guys have got to kind of create new ad hoc structures because you know there's no clear delivery mechanism. And it's kind of interesting that you've kind of got these assembly members who are obviously really interesting advocates, but you've got to help them. You've got to kind of help them work in this space. And actually, that's something I didn't talk to the first two about because they've had this experience. I'm kind of interested about how do you respond to the kind of propositions I've just made there? Does that make sense to you? Kat, you were kind of nodding at some of it. What are your are we kind of capturing the right dynamics here? Or do you think there's other things that
yeah. I think there's a couple of things. So there's the motivation to act is really important, right? So we have seen that we have quite a lot of green promises in the UK from government, but the implementation of those is really lagging. And we're also being forced into this as we approach a general election. We're being forced into like wedge issues and narratives of like people don't want this. They want to focus on the cost of living crisis. They want to focus on other things, which actually the People's Assembly demonstrated that that's not true, that this is a priority for people and they see it as completely two sides of the same coin. They see their health and their well-being and nature's ability to thrive as completely connected. So it's not just the motivation to act, but it's also setting that public mandate to show that this isn't going anywhere. And there is an issue of democracy in the UK, and that's not necessarily a WWF position. It's not something that we would ever speak of externally, and it's not something that we are focused on. We are a wildlife charity. We're not a democracy charity, but giving people the opportunity to engage with their voice as citizens is a really important process that will enable more people to advocate for this. So we saw that citizenship as a really important aspect to it too. So citizenship within the assembly process and demonstrating that as large organizations with responsibility, we are listening. And that was really important. And then to your other point around timing and clear delivery mechanisms, we've had an interesting we've had multiple facets of impact from the People's Plan. We've had political parties independently respond from all 4 nations of the UK. And as well as wider organisations too. So we've had Aviva, which is a big insurance company in the UK, fund £1 million worth of community fund work. So putting money back into communities in order to do more nature-based activities and linking that directly to the People's Plan. And we've also seen that councils have also taken up the call to arms in certain places. So Hull City Council recently enabled more land to be given over to food growers at the community level, which is a call to action from the People's Plan. So there is impact that's happening. I think the thing that we need to do is integrate work that's already happening in this space with the People's Plan to strengthen work on both sides. The People's Plan is strengthened by demonstrations of the calls to action being enacted, whether that's Hull City Council or the people taking on actions. So as WWF, RSPB and National Trust, we've also funded more work to communities as well, which we were able to get funded because we could show the People's Plan actually called for it. So we are having impact, but you're right, it's a bit ad hoc, it's difficult. We've faced as well, we're going into, I mean, it's no surprise to anyone, the UK government is messy at the moment, to say the least, and we've managed to get massive headway with some ministers, and then 3 weeks later they've been shuffled into a different position. But that's always going to be the case for government, and so having impact be broader than government and focus in on actors that have responsibility beyond the UK government, we're getting impact in different ways, and that impact we can then use backwards to influence government again when we have a new government in what we say, 6 to 12 months time. I don't know. So.
No, I think that's really interesting. But I think there's a really interesting issue here, and I'm kind of interested to what maybe Percy has something to say about this as well, is the infrastructure. How do civil society organizations very often are used to working in a particular way, you know, in terms of campaigning and advocacy, and then you bring an assembly into the picture, and whether you actually have the infrastructure around you to if you like, to advocate for that well enough. And I think my sense, Kat, is you've been learning as you've been doing, trying to figure out how to do that. That's my sense. Percy, do you have any sort of reflections looking back at it, thinking what kind of infrastructure could we have put around the assembly as civil society organizations, you know, after in impact, in terms of impact?
Yeah, first, at the core of it, you need an organization that really has the spirit for it. And then you really run into problems that you deal with advocacy groups that do not think in a democratic manner.
Right.
I was actually positively surprised that so many, and some of the larger, in Germany also the WWF, agreed fairly easily and soon to support something where there's an open end to it. They didn't know what the outcome was going to be. To this day, actually, I don't know why that happened, but I was positively surprised in many ways. But then again, others didn't do it, like the unions. But there's something to overcome. There's also just systematically, you know, at the system level, NGOs do have are egoistic, have a natural organizational egotism. And so whenever you ask them for resources, for money, we made it very low level, just sign that you support the whole thing. But we had a few meetings, no monetary resources were required. Today, ideally, I would ask them to actually join with the very face of their organization, with the leader, and not just with some staff member who shows up. It should be really high on the agenda. And all that takes time, of course, before you start out. And then on the other side, with the politicians, we systematically run into a system problem in the sense that, we have a coalition of 3 parties here now. They have a hard time working together. Each of them wants to show that we are the ones who suggested this particular measure. We played a role here. Nobody ever refers to anything from the civic society. Do you know her? So, and our assumption kind of was maybe next, after the new elections, the government change their minds and think, well, for climate, we have to really cooperate. And to make that easier, we rely on the results of the climate assembly. But that's not what happened. And it's really, really unlikely. And we have a clash of the systems here and of the ideas. It does not correspond to how our system works.
Yeah,
that's hard to overcome.
I think that's really interesting. I think the issue of that you're pointing to of NGOs operating in a particular way and trying to sort of embrace this. So I think it's a problem in both sides. I think that's really interesting. Agim, I realize you're working at a much more local level, but I'm just wondering, you know, does any of how is Zip Institute thinking about how it's going to keep this process alive afterwards? You're putting so much effort into actually doing it, and I know that's kind of like what happens, and I'm sure that I'm sure Percy and Kat would say that's exactly what happened to us. But I'm kind of thinking, what kind of role do you think Zip will play afterwards?
Well, ideally, we would work towards becoming like a hub for resources, local resources and expertise on how to help other organizations, other institutions organize citizen assemblies. This is what we would ideally do. But as I said, we are also learning by doing, because this is the first climate assembly in the country. And although we are very happy and satisfied with the progress that we have achieved so far, I think we should wait until the moment we see a tangible policy impact on how these policy recommendations are being implemented by the city of Skopje and by the Ministry of Environment here. And only then I think we can deem ourselves appropriate organization to move forward with sharing what we know and what we have gathered as expertise to other organizations, but also primarily to local level institutions, municipalities, on how they can involve and keep citizens more engaged in their daily work.
Agim, thanks for that. And Maria, you didn't need to put your hand up. I was going to come to you. So you're going to get the last word. But I mean, jump in, but I was going to ask you about what are the major lessons you've taken from this small discussion. But if you want to say something else, please do.
Yeah, I just wanted to address something that's come up in the chat, and then I also hear from Percy, among others, which is the pathway to impact. And like I said, we are aiming for processes that are setting political manifestos, but it's because of the political context in Norway, which is we're a democracy that is very organized by the parties, meaning that politicians don't really work with politics that doesn't have a basis in the party manifesto. And unlike a lot of other countries where politicians can be more individual or they have more leeway, those processes are really, really important. They set the tone for the election, and they are decided way ahead of time, longer than people would think. So if something is not reflected in the party manifestos, it could be really, really hard to bring into a national conversation. So it's more about also just not missing out on something that's pretty basic for Norwegian democracy. But I think it is not the main pathway to change, because like people have pointed out, governments can be very fickle for many reasons. Things can come up, they can commit to something and then pull that commitment. So I think for me and for us, it's more just making sure that these ideas and this assembly are on people's minds somehow, both the general public, the politicians, or that's people are not actively opposed to it also in some ways, that it doesn't come out of nowhere and disrupt their whole process or what they're thinking. So the pathway, and I think some of the pathways to impact mentioned here, which is recommendations for business or landowners, for individuals themselves, are also very valuable lessons, and not just thinking about how do we affect government or how do we affect parties.
Great. That's really, really well said. And I think that the challenge there is each time you add a different type of impact, you're actually having to build a different infrastructure and processes in order to actually enable that. But I think it's absolutely right. So listen, this has been a really, really fruitful conversation already. Thank you very much. What we'd like to do is to give an opportunity for others to participate in the in this conversation. We're going to just take a short break in a minute, but when we come back, we're going to go into breakout groups where we're going to look at this question about when civil society organisations should commission, what challenges we think they face, and what lessons you think we can draw from previous examples. Welcome back, everybody. And there's a small hardcore of people who stay till the end, which is always very impressive. I'm just trying to think. So from group 2.
It's me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Do you want to have us in the big group, because it might be easier rather than spotlighting? It's up to you. Anyway, so go for it. What you were saying in group.
Is it okay? Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
We had some technical problems. So, but I made some notes, at least few of them. There was nearing it, Casey and Alex and me. And we had to find your questions, but it was not from we didn't have it from the beginning. So we started our conversations. And one point from Casey was we need standards on climate assemblies, because if there are too many different modes of climate assemblies, other deliberation processes, we would downgrade them, because anyone can make whatever he wants and calls it deliberation climate assembly. So we need more or less strict standards. Alex from Malaga said that we have a common society between civil society, politicians, and experts, but we have different languages they are using. And we need a new language or a translation process that they can understand each other. And therefore, the deliberation processes are very helpful if they're designed in a proper way. My point, not new, was I'm always concentrating on the outcome of climate assemblies if they have an impact on climate policy. And again, I said I couldn't find one in the world. This is what would be more than would have been done anyway, especially, for example, what green parties, etc., brought in coalition treaties, etc. And we need a combination with direct democracy, as in ancient Greece. But for example, Casey again said we can't compare those old societies with our new complex societies, and referenda have a binary outcome, and they're a little bit hindering to do compromises and find new ways. We didn't have the time to discuss this even in more details. And maybe I will get some.
Owen, you're breaking up. I think we'll just have to. Don't worry. We'll have to leave it there.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm almost finished. I just said I wanted to have a note of Neri, but then we had frozen computers, and I couldn't get her main position.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that.
We had some technical problems.
Okay. Thanks, Owen. What do we have from group 3?
I've been designated a spokesperson. We were a small group of 4, and I think I had 2 points I would like to bring back to this conversation. The one is on what impact is. We touched a little bit upon this in the main session, but also just having worked on this for almost a year now, talking to people in civil society, politicians, funders, collaborators, NGOs about citizens' assemblies and what this could do for this question, but also for other questions in general, I think is an impact that is very hard to measure or like find in policy documents, at least in the short term. But that is probably changing minds, not as fast as we would like and not as efficiently as we would like, but we've kept our focus on this for a full year now. And I think that the Norwegian government has just commissioned its first national citizens' assembly on sustainability after we've been calling for it for years, not like publicly, but talking to people and raising this as an opportunity to engage people. So that is one kind of impact also. And then we also talked about legitimacy, and especially in our case where we are both organizing, convening, trying to bring this into life, but are also imagining, can we facilitate this? Can we be the secretariat somehow? And our positions on this question, and how does that affect the assembly legitimacy as a whole? How are we perceived is one thing, and what we actually do and the governance structure, how that's set up is a different one. So those are 2 points from our conversation.
That's great. That's really interesting. The legitimacy one, I think, comes back to something we started talking about at the beginning. That's really interesting. And then from group 4,
I think that's going to be me.
I think I recognize you.
Yes. So we had a really interesting conversation in our group, which we started out saying, so when should civil society organization organize climate assemblies? And the point being that there is a balance. There should be a minimum of resources in place, because it's important to think about that we can uphold the certain standards for assemblies. So in the meantime, there is a risk of overusing assemblies. So keep in mind what the purpose of the assembly is. Is it a means of advocacy, or is it a way to introduce deliberative methods? And when thinking about that purpose, whether it's one of those or another, you can use that to figure out, okay, when should we do it? How should we do it? And then some lessons from previous assemblies was that it's a good idea to include stakeholders from the beginning, also in the design, because challenges also usually or often comes down to the implementation part. And the follow-up. And just as when a government commissioned assemblies, the same goes for civil society organized assemblies, that if you include stakeholders early in the phase, then it's easier to do the follow-up as well. And then two last points. One being that there was an interest of Knoca doing more work on transnational stuff, so more across borders. Can we use this network to figure out and learn how to raise the impact or gain more assemblies transnational as well. And then the last one being that there is some interesting lessons to learn from the Oregon process, which was a deliberative mini-public, but not a climate assemblies, but still there was some interesting principles they used on how to tackle this legitimacy problem, where they had people from both sides of the assembly. I'm not sure exactly who the actor was, but they should kind of sign after observing the process or being part of the process, signing that they found the process to be fair and that it has legitimacy. So they have like these people actually kind of acknowledging that this is a fair process.
In France, they actually have this position called a guarantor, which is actually sort of established people with political profile who kind of sign, who, if you like, sign up for its integrity. I guess the issue there is you're trying to find people from different political persuasions, ensuring that. Yeah, that's really good. Fantastic. Thank you. Very good. You can come back again. Stina, were there 5 groups, or was it 4?
Yes, we have group number 7, I think, is the last one. And then number 1, which was
I was in that one.
Yeah, did you get to?
Yeah, we've done it. So we've got one last set of feedback then. Does someone want to speak from the other group?
Tom, why don't you speak?
That's group 7, but does anyone? Yeah, shall I speak? Yeah, I've been speaking a lot.
Hey Tom, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. It's a lovely end to my working day. Thanks. It's great to see you all. Yeah, busy as ever. What do we come up with in group 7? Let's see whether we got kept on the topic. So whether to do a citizens assembly or not. So we talked about the fact that sometimes it's kind of a meta process of civil society or other organizations pushing forward new forms of democracy as much as it is about the individual process. We want to take part in this growing movement. We want to push this movement forward. We want to learn how to do democracy differently, as well as we're really interested in the outcomes of this particular engagement or others. So we're saying it's a big meta question as well as a specific question. We also talked about the challenge for civil society organizations that are accountable to their members or their funders, and can they show the impact that they're having, which is, obviously it's going to be diffuse and it's going to be, maybe hard to track. And there's a challenge there. And we talked about a positive example where a funding pot just said, yes, run a citizens assembly, go ahead. And now they're doing that, and that's fine. We talked about the situation in Sweden where the government is not going to call any climate assemblies. So it's simply civil society does it or nobody does it. So if we want Swedish people to have the opportunity to take part in this thing, then it's going to have to be civil society. So yes, they should. We talked about the fact that the Global Assembly is still discussed positively, that it was a bit of a beacon. It put this on the agenda for a lot of people. It brought diverse people into a big global process. So maybe that's just, yes, good, more like that. We talked about one of the outcomes from the People's Plan for Nature being, I think as often happens when people have a chance to say what should happen next after a deliberative process, they say more of this. So they said we should institutionalize a nature assembly in the UK. And then there's a question of where does that sit? Is that sponsored by civil society? Is that something that we pressure existing governance structures to take on for themselves? You know, how does that kind of thing fit? And we finished up talking about whether civil society organized processes might be more open to more diverse critical voices in the evidence provision stage or not. And I'm not sure we came up with a definitive outcome on that, because it started to sound like, well, it depends who organizes the process, maybe, you know, independent of the commissioning body. But I think we'd need more evidence to understand that. That's maybe an interesting place to start exploring. And that's what we did.
That's really interesting. Thanks so much, Tom. Okay, that's been really interesting. I mean, I'll just sort of throw out some sort of thoughts that have come together as this has been going on. I think one of the interesting challenges here, which has been referred to throughout this conversation, is this challenge of civil society organizations who organize to actually then be able to do follow-up. And part of that was interesting that Tom was talking about funding there, but it's also about whether civil society organizations are able to keep this at the top of their own agenda. I know, for example, you know, sort of they've got competing demands, competing advocacy chain, you know, competing pressures on them. So there's a really interesting problem about how civil society organizations can keep this alive. I think Percy was talking about this through a whole electoral cycle, maybe 3 or 4 years, and that's quite hard, I think, for CSOs to think about in terms of their competing demands. I think there's some really interesting questions here about the way that CSOs are not only trying to deal with the climate and ecological crisis, but also trying to sort of make some sort of contribution in relation to the democratic crisis. And that's really interesting. I think from hearing from Agim was really interesting about working in a fragile state, and actually this being a really important demonstration about how democracy can be done differently. So I think it's been a really interesting call. It's just, as with all our calls, it's generated even more questions than it has answers. But that's the beauty of a network like ours. I think regardless of what we say in this call, CSOs are going to continue doing this. And I think they will be continuing to run assemblies, and more of them will be happening. And I think it's really important for us as a network to help those CSOs deliver as good a processes as they can. And I think it opens up potentially a really interesting space to deal with those issues that governments aren't willing to deal with. I remember someone saying to me that you can't imagine a government at the moment being willing to, for example, put degrowth on the agenda, but maybe a civil society organization would be willing to do that. And so there's really interesting questions here about whether CSOs can open up agendas that governments just won't go towards, that aren't prepared to act. So listen, it's been a really interesting afternoon. Thank you, everybody. I just want to let you know that on the 2nd of May, we've just announced that we're going to be doing a session on a report that we're going to produce. I'm going to have to write it very quickly, on the emerging trends, challenges and opportunities. Knoca tries to produce a report each year, which tries to bring up to date where we see activity happening, and obviously one of those is around civil society. So please do come and join us. I'll be presenting the findings from that report, and Erica Hope from European Climate Foundation and Claudia from Democracy Next will be responding, and we'll hopefully be able to have a conversation about where we think climate assemblies are actually going over the coming years. Once again, before we leave, I'd like to thank Percy, I'd like to thank Kat, I'd like to thank Agim, and I'd like to thank Marie for just being so open and thoughtful about the processes they have been involved with and they're involved with now. I'd like to my colleagues at Democracy X, who have done a great job as ever, making this all happen, of actually behind the scenes. That's wonderful. And again, I'd like to thank you as members of the network for just bringing your creativity and imagination into this space. Enjoy the rest of your week, and take care, everybody. Bye-bye.